Ecossaise, the Palace of Saint Germain en Laye plays a significant role in the novels, as this is the base of the secret unit of elite men of the Garde Ecossaise, who have sworn to protect the life of Louis XIV and innocents from certain death. This is where Hamilton's office is located, and where our narrator of the novels, Robert Meldrum, meets Hamilton properly for the first time and is invited to be part of the guard. Meldrum recounts his first journey through the Palace of Saint Germain, waiting at the gates, and then being taken through the large courtyard and up a narrow staircase to the servants' quarters in the attic at the back of the castle. Hamilton's office is located down a long dark corridor. We get the impression that the office is, unsurprisingly, located in a part of the palace which is little used. Indeed, the door or entrance leading to Hamilton's office looks like the entrance to a storeroom or a cupboard. Its true purpose is concealed. Finally, Alexander Murray, who is taking Robert Meldrum to the office, states that Saint-Germain is fast becoming a favourite place for the visiting British and Irish expatriate communities. This podcast will introduce the history of the royal connections of this region which lay to the west of Paris, especially before Louis XIV moves his court to Versailles in 1682. It will explore the Palace of Saint Germain and paint a picture of life in these residences for those who were part of the royal household. Finally, it will place the palace in its wider British and Irish context by exploring the British and Irish expatriate community at Saint Germain en Laye prior to 1682. The modern-day Département of Yvelines, in which the royal residences of Saint Germain en Laye, Rambouillet and Versailles are located, are known collectively as Le Grand Couronne, or the Large Crown in English, and it acts as an outer ring marking the suburbs of Paris. It is no coincidence that it has been given the name given its history and connections with old regime France. This area was used by successive French monarchs to escape the dirt and grime of Paris in the early modern period. It was often a welcome refuge from the royal pressures and government administration. To understand why Louis XIV moved his court and French government to Versailles in 1682, we have to understand why this area to the west of Paris was so important for the French royal family. The Palace of Saint Germain en Laye, which in actual fact consists of two palaces, both old and new, played a significant role in the lives of the Bourbon royal family and Louis XIV himself. Louis XIV was conceived around December 1637, when the usually estranged king and queen spent time at the old Chateau of Saint Germain en Laye. Louis XIV was born in the new palace at Saint Germain en Laye 9 months later on the 5th of September 1638, a much longed for and anticipated Dauphin of France. His formal baptism took place in the chapel at the old Chateau of Saint Germain en Laye. King Louis XIII, Louis XIV's father, died at Saint Germain en Laye in May 1643, and thereafter Louis XIV became monarch. During the Fronde, the royal family found refuge at the Palace of Saint Germain en Laye at a critical time when there was disorder in Paris. On the 5th of January 1649, Anne of Austria made a secret plan to spirit the king out of Paris, fearing danger to the king's person by the crowds and nobles who had revolted against the crown. Of course, there is an important Franco-British context here, because at the same time, Charles I was awaiting trial at the hands of a purged English Parliament, which resulted in King Charles I's execution on the 30th of January 1649. We cannot be sure if Anne of Austria saw this added dimension at the time, but considering that Charles I's wife, Queen Henrietta Maria, was at the French court, this seems highly likely. However, we must not underestimate how traumatic this move would have been, from the Palais Royal in Paris, where at that time Anne of Austria lived with her 2 sons, to the Palace of Saint Germain en Laye. This was a real upset for the 2 young princes, who had unsurprisingly grown accustomed to royal luxuries and protocols. This move was done with the utmost secrecy and at short notice, because the Palace of Saint Germain en Laye was not prepared for the royal family's arrival. It did not escape Louis XIV at that time that the family had to flee under the cover of darkness and in the dead of night to remain safe. At 3 a.m. in the morning, in the bitter cold and darkness, Louis XIV was told to get dressed to board a carriage to take him out of Paris. Yet, it was unlikely that he knew of the plans himself, and that he had to follow the instructions given to him by his mother. It must have been distressing and frightening for both him and his brother Philippe. When Louis XIV and his brother arrived at Saint Germain en Laye, they arrived at a cold and empty palace, which was wholly unprepared for the royals in residence. As Madame Motteville describes, the king, the queen, and the nobles that came with them found themselves without beds, attendants, and without bed linen. The queen slept in a small bed that Cardinal Mazarin had sent to the palace days earlier. There was another bed for Louis XIV and another 2 military camp beds, one for Louis's brother Philippe and another for the cardinal himself. All nobles who came with the family, including those of royal blood, spent the night sleeping on straw. The gates of Paris were shut, and this caused the royal family and their household major problems. As Josephine Wilkinson, a leading biographer of the Sun King, has stated, Louis and Anne were deprived of every necessity. They endured hardship for several days until supplies finally came through. This Spartan existence must have been a shock for the young king and his brother, and left this lingering feeling of vulnerability that never left Louis XIV for the rest of his days. Furthermore, despite his tender age of 10 years, Louis XIV became aware of the monarchy's fragility. However, for Louis XIV, the Palace of Saint Germain en Laye became associated with safety and refuge, and it became one of the main royal residences during his reign. After Louis XIV's marriage to Marie-Thérèse in 1660, as Queen, Marie-Thérèse would spend the winter months at Saint Germain en Laye with her 2 children and Louis XIV. Marie-Thérèse also gave birth to a daughter at Saint Germain en Laye. Saint Germain en Laye was clearly associated with family, away from the court politics and intrigue. It also was a safe place for the family should accidents, illness, or death occur, as it did in February 1661 when the Louvre was ravaged by fire. This refuge became all too apparent after the death of his mother Anne of Austria in 1666, where Louis XIV spent some time at Saint Germain en Laye and at Versailles. Another indicator that Saint Germain en Laye was an important residence for Louis XIV was that some important ministers, such as Jean-Baptiste Colbert and François-Michel de Tellier, Marquis de Louvois, all owned personal residences and large properties in the town. Another note of interest is that the famous landscaper André Lenotre is responsible for the garden terrace at the new Chateau of Saint Germain en Laye. By the 1670s, Saint Germain had become the main royal residence, as Versailles remained under construction. Even the famous English political theorist John Locke visited Saint Germain in 1678 and watched as Louis XIV started his day with prayers, and Locke was impressed by the king's devotion to God. The old Chateau of Saint Germain plays a central role in the Garde Ecossaise novels, because this is where Hamilton's office is based and where Meldrum meets Hamilton for the first time, as Meldrum states.
I was taken to a door at the back of the palace, and then up a narrow staircase leading to what can only be described as servant quarters in the attic. They were sparsely decorated but functional. It was residential accommodation for many of Louis XIV's servants. He then led me down a dark corridor towards a door, a plain door with oak panelling but without any of the famous decoration and style which France at this time was known for.
Behind this ordinary-looking door was the office of Lieutenant Colonel John Hamilton. So what was the old Palace of Saint Germain really like? We are extremely fortunate that Professor Edward Corp has managed to gather some key sources which gives us an idea of how the chateau functioned as a royal residence. These include floor plans, which can be found in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, plus the household lists of King James II found in the Carte collection at the University of Oxford, alongside some French studies on the old Chateau of Saint Germain, which give us a rough idea about how the old chateau was organised. Corp has drawn floor plans of the chateau which show the layout and activities within the palace. To approach the old chateau, Meldrum would have walked up a steep road from the river to the royal estate, and during this walk he would have seen several buildings, including the royal stables and kennels, plus an old tennis court. He would have walked past the Maison du Contrôlier and turned a sharp right and walked across the drawbridge to reach the entrance of the Chateau Vaux. As Meldrum notes in the Garde Ecossaise, he was taken across a large courtyard in the centre of the chateau. Indeed, the old Chateau of Saint Germain was, as Corp describes, an irregular pentagon shape with a large courtyard in the middle. The third floor of the chateau was occupied by staff, including chaplains, barbers, and a physician, as well as other senior staff. The royal apartments were located on the second floor, with public presence chambers for meeting guests and officials. It also contained bedchambers and rooms for guards. The second floor also included a small chapel and a theatre for entertainment. The first floor contained accommodation for courtiers and senior staff. The ground floor contained the large chapel where Louis XIV himself had been baptized, and also accommodation for chaplains. The ground floor also contained the kitchens, a larder, also with accommodation for kitchen staff such as the king's master cook. There was also accommodation for the guards, which stood at the three entrances of the chateau. The area below stairs contained a woodyard, cellars, and a pantry. The main character of the novel, John Hamilton, is in the attic, out of the way of the king, the courtiers, and the senior staff. Of course, this was to allow the Garde Ecossaise to maintain secrecy as to their activities, but it was not unusual for ordinary staff to receive accommodation in the attic, and this was certainly the case at Versailles. Indeed, we are told by Robert Meldrum that the room is down a long dark corridor, presumably away from other rooms. We are given the impression that Hamilton and his men are in one corner or section of the attic within the chateau, with a narrow staircase leading to these rooms. Yet this staircase is concealed by a door, and it leads directly up to Hamilton's part of the attic. Again, this is to underscore the secrecy of his unit and his understated presence at court. In the Garde Ecossaise, Murray explains to Meldrum that Saint Germain was becoming a favourite place amongst the British and Irish expatriate communities. What did he mean? Although King James II and his household did not arrive in France until 1688, Saint-Germain-en-Laye was a place that many British and Irish visitors to France had lived in or visited. In the 1640s and 1650s, Saint-Germain-en-Laye was home to a diverse community of royalist exiles who were still loyal to the House of Stuart and thus could no longer live in Britain and Ireland. Saint-Germain-en-Laye was a particular draw to this community because this is where the household of the exiled Queen Henrietta Maria was located, as well as the exiled household of her son Charles, Prince of Wales, later to be crowned King Charles II of Britain and Ireland at Scone Palace in 1651. Charles II's household was firmly established in October 1651 after the defeat of the Royalist Presbyterian forces in September 1651. Therefore, Saint-Germain-en-Laye was home to a significant number of British and Irish subjects at this time. It was a truly diverse British and Irish community, which included government ministers, soldiers, some of which were Irish Catholic exiles, physicians, Anglican chaplains, and in fact a wide array of household staff were present, as well as King Charles II's closest friends. Therefore, Saint-Germain-en-Laye was home to a significant number of British and Irish subjects at this time. The court of Charles II and that of Queen Henrietta Maria shuttled between the Louvre and Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Charles II's court remained in Paris until 1654. Some exiled royalists such as Germain, Berkeley and Percy chose to stay in Saint-Germain-en-Laye on a permanent basis. Berkeley and Germain were attached to James, the Duke of York's household. The Duke of York later became King James II in 1685. Life in the royal households were not trouble-free, as it was often a place of factionalism and infighting. As Geoffrey Smith points out, this was certainly the case for the household of James, Duke of York, where Henrietta Maria alienated many in the household with her interference, and Berkeley and Germain fought over power and influence. As it consisted of those forced out of their native country by circumstance, it was a very unhappy community, as men bickered for a limited number of employment opportunities, battled xenophobia from the French, and often had shortages of money, food, and accommodation, which resulted in duels to redeem their reputations from slander and insult. Sometimes these duels could be between royalists themselves, and sometimes between royalists and the French nobility. Some of the courtiers and government ministers in the court of Charles II in Saint-Germain-en-Laye spent their exile pursuing their intellectual interests and their own networks, and the most famous amongst these was Thomas Hobbes, author of the famous political treatise Leviathan, which at the time of King Charles II's exiled court in the 1650s was being prepared for publication. Besides the political and philosophical intellectual network, there were a religious and theological network driven by a sizable episcopal community who had been driven into exile by the outlawing of episcopacy by the English Parliament and the Scottish Covenanters. Indeed, the religious community did not stand still, and those ministers who wanted to be ordained in the Episcopal Church came to Paris, were ordained by Richard Browne, within whose chapel many of the services for ordination were undertaken. The household of Queen Henrietta Maria was multifaceted, especially in the 1640s, during Britain's civil wars, when it became a fundraising centre for the royalist cause, as well as a centre of diplomacy for the royalist court. It also became a military operations centre, as the exiled Stuarts gave their blessing for military endeavours undertaken by the Irish, Scottish and English royalists. These courts also ran a network of agents and spies in the 1640s and 1650s, who would gather intelligence on events for the royalist court in Britain and Ireland. Sometimes these murky networks could contain double agents such as Colonel Joseph Bramfield, who seemingly had royalist sympathies but fed a constant stream of information back to John Thurlow, Cromwell's head of intelligence during the English Republic. Bramfield was a key inspiration behind the character Timothy Grey in the Garde Ecossaise novel. Of course, these exiles returned to Britain and Ireland when the monarchy returned in 1660. Yet because Charles II had spent a significant amount of time in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, many of the connections forged within the 1650s continued throughout the 1660s and 1670s. Furthermore, by the 1670s, Louis XIV had made Saint-Germain-en-Laye his principal residence, and many British and Irish visitors came to Saint-Germain-en-Laye. One of the most enduring symbols of friendship between King Louis XIV and King Charles II that continued to connect them both to Saint-Germain-en-Laye was Louis XIV's Scottish Guard, which of course has particular significance for the historical fiction novel Garde Ecossaise. There were a number of units with Scottish connection that had served the Bourbons throughout the early modern period, most notably in the 1660s, when the Scottish Regiment under Lord George Douglas followed French standards of conduct. Although they served Louis XIV, their ultimate loyalty was in fact to King Charles II. Lord George Douglas, despite his Scottish lineage, was treated like any French noble or soldier. He was seen as a courtier and moved amongst the royal circles in Paris. Like the royalist exiles in the 1650s, he managed to get involved in a serious duel by which all accounts could have ended his life. There is also some continuity in the diplomacy too, as William Lockhart, who had served as the head diplomat between France and England in the later 1650s, continued to serve France under King Charles II, and was a well-known face at the French court in the 1670s. Saint-Germain also had its fair share of British visitors, one of whom we already know, John Locke, the famous political philosopher and author of the Treatise of Government, who visited France in the 1670s. Louis XIV's rising and dressing in the morning was very much a public affair, full of ritual and ceremony to project kingly authority, and as long as visitors were well dressed, they could have access to the palace grounds. Some of the British visitors to Saint Germain may not have been as entirely wholesome as Locke, as Charles II had his agents and spies in France reporting back on the activities within the French court. In the novel La Garde Ecossaise, Hamilton's men fit within this wider context of British communities at Saint-Germain-en-Laye and in Paris. That concludes episode 1 of season 2 of the La Garde Ecossaise podcast. Please remember that the historical fiction novel can be purchased from all online bookstores. Next week we will be exploring early modern warfare and in particular its codes of conduct and rules of engagement. Until then, au revoir and à bientôt. Voice of Robert Meldrum provided by Gaz Carr. Sound files provided by KevP888 and Paul Couture via Freesound.
This podcast is the copyright of History Gateway Limited, UK.